Thank you very much, Henrik. Um, I understand that I have a few minutes to speak about the paper. So I would like to make 4 or 5 points that around which the paper revolves. Like many of you here, I've been interested in the possibilities for decolonizing knowledge, the possibilities for successful decolonization of knowledge, the conditions under which that can happen. And I think after being involved in this for a number of years, there are a few observations that I feel I can make about the context and some of the problems involved. Now, the first thing, the first point I wanted to make is more of a personal note. Like I think all of you, came to this topic certainly because it was an issue that was discussed in academia when I was a student. So the problem had already been identified in the literature. But in addition to that, this was also an area that my late father, Syed Hussein Alatas, was involved in very much. He wrote his well-received work, The Myth of the Lazy Native. That was in 1977. But even before that, and that work was a critique of colonial discourse on the so-called natives of Malaya, Indonesia, and the Philippines. But even before that, he had written about, in the 60s, actually in the late 50s, he wrote about intellectual imperialism, and in the 70s about the idea of the captive mind. So obviously I had that influence in my thinking as well. And what has struck me over the years is that the generation of my father, and that would include several scholars in India, some in the Philippines, some in Latin America, some in Indonesia. That generation had spoken about these issues, and then I found that my generation was speaking about the same issues, about the need to decolonize, nationalize, indigenize, and so on and so forth, knowledge. In many cases, not in all cases, but in many cases, we were repeating the critique and repeating the call for decolonized knowledge. The language, the terminology may have been different. For example, in the generation of my father, there was much less of a post-modernist, post-colonialist type of discourse, and certainly not the terminology. But what I found interesting is that we, even when I was writing about these things from the 90s onwards, we were still repeating the critique and the call without actually doing the decolonized knowledge. And so my interest was therefore to suggest that we should do the critique, and people, particularly the next generation, our students should be reminded of that this critique is ongoing, and that it dates back to previous generations. But apart from that, we also need to go about the work of doing decolonized, creating decolonized knowledge. For me, that means two things at least. It means being theoretically original, conceptually original, and methodologically pluralistic. What I mean by being theoretically or conceptually original is that there is a need to look at local sources for ideas and concepts in the social sciences. I don't have much time to go into detail, but just to give you a simple example, my interest is in Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun is one candidate for a decolonized theory. And I think similar or such candidates can be identified in all societies and all civilizations. So this is what I mean by being theoretically or conceptually innovative or original. The Arabs, Ibn Khaldun was an Arab, and the Arabs have access to his work in Arabic, although of course he's been translated to other languages. But the Arabs for about 150 years have been proclaiming Ibn Khaldun as the founder of sociology, but never really did anything with him. They didn't. They wrote descriptive works about Ibn Khaldun, but they didn't develop a Khaldunian or a neo-Khaldunian theory. And they had only really discovered Ibn Khaldun as a founder of sociology after that point was made by European scholars in the 19th century. What is interesting about Ibn Khaldun, and it tells you something about how these things go. In the 19th century, most of the people who took notice of Ibn Khaldun were people involved with Middle Eastern or North African or Islamic studies. But there were a few scholars, and some of them very well known, who had nothing to do with Middle Eastern or Islamic studies. Toynbee was, Toynbee of course is not 19th century, but he was an example. But in the 19th century you have some Europeans, the French, Italians, a couple of Germans, a German sociologist, Franz Oppenheimer, wrote in German anyway. Ludwig Gumplowicz also wrote in German. They were not in Middle Eastern studies or North African studies, but they took a serious interest in Ibn Khaldun and wrote about him. Had they entered the canon, then Ibn Khaldun would have a much more prominent place in the canon than as compared to today, where he has practically no place. But they were not included in the canon as it emerged, and so interest in Ibn Khaldun was also basically lost or confined to area studies. And I wonder whether we can recount similar stories in other area studies, whether you talk about India, or you talk about Southeast Asia or China. So I think part of our work involves the discovery or rediscovery, the identification of such sources. My next point is that the earlier discourse, the discourse of my father's generation on the need to decolonize knowledge was not necessarily anti-capitalist. And maybe that is a significant difference between that discourse and the discourse today. In other words, while they were critical about received knowledge, they were critical about dependency on ideas from the center, kind of academic dependency. They were critical of what they perceived to be the lack of relevance of knowledge. In fact, in India, Professor Yogendra Singh edited a very short-lived journal called Relevant Sociology. I think that was in the 80s. There were just a few issues came out. So while they had all these concerns, they did not take a position for or against capitalism. In other words, I think the assumption was that one could be pro-capitalist and still be academically independent in terms of not being colonized intellectually. And I think this idea really takes a turn with the newer generation of scholars. If you look at the writing of Ray Winn, Southern Theory, Walter Mignolo on decoloniality, there is a position to be taken against not just knowledge colonization, but also the very order that that form of knowledge, the interests of those who control the order, that form of knowledge advances. So I think this is something which those of us who are working, with students, I think we will realize that, and I feel this in the case of my own region, particularly in Malaysia and Indonesia, perhaps it is not an accident that there's also a revival of interest in socialism and in Marxism. When I was a student, and I'm sure those of you who are older than me, when you were students, Marxism was, especially in sociology, was very much in vogue. And then sociology departments tended to become more conservative and more statistical in orientation, more quantitative. But I realized that there is a revival, at least in our part of the world, in Marxism and socialism in the form of study groups and reading groups, and these are taking place outside of the universities because they're not getting it in the university. So there is this idea that critical theory, one source of that is Marxism, but they're not only reading Marx, but they're also interested in the 19th century, early 20th century Indonesians and Malayans who were reading Marx and developing Marxist theory for their own particular region. So I think that's an interesting point to make. Finally, I think in my own work, as I said earlier, the task of decolonizing knowledge has to do with, requires our being theoretically innovative and methodologically pluralistic. I realize I have not explained what I meant by methodological pluralism, but maybe that can come out in the discussion. So we need to be theoretically innovative, original, which involves, not exclusively, but it does involve going to various non-Western sources. But at the same time, our social theory should deal with real problems, real concerns. Now that might seem to be obvious to many of us, but when you actually look at research that goes on the ground, you find that there's a lot of research that is not so relevant and not so that doesn't speak to the concerns of people. Why? Because resources are allocated to areas of research which have been suggested by a research agenda that is drawn up elsewhere. To give you an example, you find among political scientists, among security people, and even sociologists, there's a lot of attention to the study of Islamic, or I should say Muslim extremism, fundamentalism, and so on, which is important, of course. But they are focused mainly on the violent manifestations of Muslim extremism. You have a larger area of non-violent Muslim extremism, which, because it is not a direct threat to our lives, falls under, what's the term, under the radar, is not captured, right? There tends to be less interest in that. And more importantly, the even larger field of Muslim revival that is not extremist, for example, Sufi movements, are understudied. So this is what I mean by, how our theory and our research in general should deal with what is actually happening on the ground. And finally, and I think for me this is the most interesting part of doing social theory, when it is more applied, is that it should demystify our reality. And I, gave an example in my paper, which maybe some preliminary remarks on what I would like to become, maybe a book one day. I would love to write a book called the Salafi Ethic and the Spirit of Vulgar Capitalism. Because what you see in Saudi Arabia today, and in other parts of the Muslim world, but it's very vivid in Saudi Arabia, you have the destruction of heritage in the name of religion. The heritage is being destroyed because that heritage represents wrongful religious innovation. For example, you have the shrine of a saint. Now, for the vast majority of Muslims around the world, visitation to shrines to respect the saint is something that's not only permissible but encouraged. But for this puritanical group that runs Saudi Arabia, this is regarded as wrongful innovation, and they are discouraged and even prohibited. So in the name of discouraging wrongful acts of worship, they have destroyed much heritage in Makkah and in Medina. But you see, in place of these old buildings, they build hotels and restaurants and some of the icons of capitalism, right? So here, what you have is what Weber referred to as I forget the term. There is perhaps an unintended consequence of this Salafi doctrine, and there's also, yes, what you call an elective affinity between Salafi ideas and capitalism. But it's a vulgar form of capitalism, because in Europe, limits were set. In many European cities, and I think it must be the same in Australia and other places. There are limits to how high you can build within the certain radius of the old city, and so on and so forth. So I'm saying this as an example of demystification, because Islamic economics presents itself as an alternative to both capitalism and socialism. But what we see here is economic policies in action in the world's most quote-unquote Islamic state that actually goes hand in hand with the most vulgar form of capitalism. So, showing that what presents itself as an alternative is not really an alternative. So those are a few points that I think my paper revolves around, and happy to have a discussion. Thank you.
Okay. So, thank you very much, Henrik and Nordic Center, for the invitation to be here, and especially for the opportunity to read all of these papers, which I found really a wonderful experience, and I learned a great deal. I learned a lot from Dr. Alatas's paper as well. And one thing that particularly struck me was the novel way with which it begins, with personal remarks. The sentence at the end of his introductory section is, "I would like to end this introduction with a personal note," and then he goes into some of his own background, which he's just mentioned. One of the points that he focuses on is that he lives in two worlds in some respects, works in the what can be perceived as the global north if we're working with economic terms in Singapore, and lives in what is generally regarded as the global south in Malaysia. And I was struck by this as the place where the paper launches, because I have the same background myself. I live in the global south in Delhi and work in the north in New York and Rome. So I felt an immediate connection with the paper, which is interesting for far more rigorous reasons than just this. I'm going to go section by section through the 6 sections, each of which I will name and very briefly describe for the sake of the audience, and then ask 6 questions. So I have a number of comments, but more or less I have one principal question with respect to each of the sections of the paper. So in the introductory remarks, the first of the 6 sections, the 6th being a conclusion, so there are 4 substantive sections. In the introductory remark, you mention first this idea of the South as a heuristic concept. Now, I saw this term used, heuristic, in 2 or 3 of the papers from the workshop, and so I assume there's a classic or a recent work in sociology or social theory that uses this term. I'm not familiar with this use of the term as heuristic as an ideal type, because in rational choice and political theory, heuristic is quite the opposite of an ideal type. Nevertheless, I get the point very well, and it's an extremely important one. The way I paraphrase, I think, the question you ask in the introduction is, what is Southern about the South? Is it the income? Is it the nature of public expenditure? Is it a geographic region? Is it a conceptual region? Is it the same as terms that have been used previously, like developing world or third world? Or does it signify the intellectual or cultural periphery? Is it subalternity as such? Is it, the concept to represent subalternity? Or is it just a term like the East, which has as much utility as it has misleading connotations? You seem to come down with one concrete condition, which is academic dependency. So the first thing I would want to ask is that correct? Is that what you finally come down with? And would you like to speak more on North and South as a heuristic or a normative or an analytical concept, however you want to see it? And then the point that I really want to understand, where, if anywhere, do you locate the utility, or on the contrary, the disadvantages of these terms like global South or North, especially as someone who lives in the South and works in the North?
Oh, am I?
Yeah, if you would like.
You're not going to go through all 6 questions first. It's fine. I can.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I think the reason that I and others also have been careful in the use of the term South is because in earlier times, people talk about the East. They were often criticized for using the term in a fashion that sort of levels the whole East, or gives the impression that there's a homogeneous East, or Asia, for example. And I think that when we talk about the South, we're not obviously not referring to a geographical region. We're talking about, and first of all, we're not speaking necessarily about economics, because the economic South does not necessarily coincide with the cultural South or the academic South. So for me, I'm defining the South as those social science communities that have a relationship of academic dependency with, and I don't want to say North, but with the centers of knowledge production. Communities, social science communities or knowledge communities that are in the South, intellectually or academically speaking, may be located in the North in economic terms. I think maybe some Southern European countries, universities, communities, Japan, and you can think of some other examples which are economically developed, but not classified as third world, but in terms of social science production, they are in a state of academic dependency. Yeah.
So that is really how you want to use the.
That's how I want to use it. Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Yeah, I think
and also the North. I think it's also useful to point out that people often talk about the West, Western knowledge, knowledge from the West, domination by the West. But it's not the West. It's not the whole West. We're talking about actually a few centers of knowledge production. And I think it's still the US, the UK, and France, to the extent that it has that relationship with francophonic countries. These are really the centers. But when you talk about the West, and our students often talk about the West, we depend on the West, but it's not the entire West. So we have also not to sort of homogenize the West.
So you're using the term also to reconfigure the conception of the so-called North or West. I think that's something that, from teaching in places like the United States, I see this projection of the myth of the West, and it's very strong. The way that terms are dropped, like incorporating Plato or Aristotle into the so-called Western tradition.
Right.
I mean, this makes very little sense historically,
Yeah.
but it's a norm that has come to be introduced and parroted by everybody.
Actually, maybe I can also make a point there, and it relates to what I was saying about, I wanted to say about methodological pluralism. Muslims, for example, would say that we are dominated by the West and we need to get out of that domination. But there is much in Islamic tradition which draws from the Greek tradition, right?
Yeah.
Which is useful and important to go back to. For example, in modern social science, we teach the scientific method, which is deduction and induction, what is called in the classical tradition demonstration. It's a very narrow definition of the idea of argumentation and how you arrive at the truth. In classical times, in the Muslim world, but this comes from the Greek tradition, and it was also true of medieval Europe, there were more than, demonstration was just one of the means of arriving, arguing, and making a truth claim. There was rhetoric, there was poetic, there was dialectics, and I think our students have lost that skill. Although we still smuggle in, sometimes without realizing it, rhetorics and poetics in our work. But our students would be all the more richer, we would be all the more richer if we understood, if we taught and learned these diverse means of argumentation, and attempt to use them in our work. So that's what I mean by methodological pluralism. But that's part of Islamic tradition. This was developed by the Muslims learning from the Greeks in medieval times. But it's not to be rejected on the grounds that it originates from outside of Islamic tradition, or it's associated with the West to the extent that Plato and Aristotle are, the ancestors of Western intellectual tradition. Therefore, we cannot be too simplistic. We should not be simplistic about the way we understand the North and the South, or the West and the East.
Yeah. I have a second question about the introduction, which I was going to skip because you spoke about your own background, your father's work, and so on. But I can't resist now because when I was given your paper, I looked you up on Google and YouTube and found a lecture that you had given in Malaysia, which I thought was very interesting and important. So in that lecture, you began by addressing a Malaysian audience and speaking about decolonizing the curriculum. But you made a gesture that I thought was very interesting and unusual. You said, how many of you are actually engaged practically in achieving this goal, or is it just something that we like to talk about? And this was a kind of challenge that I have not seen that often. If you have read Ryan O'Connell's paper for today, the last paragraph mentions an anecdote basically informing us about what she wants to achieve out of so-called Southern theory. And you write that sentence, I want to end with a personal note. But the paper as a whole actually is very personal, whether consciously or not consciously, because the two case studies that you deal with in the 4th and 5th sections of the paper, I'll discuss what they are, about Islamic banking, which you had mentioned, and about issues, Hindu-Muslim issues in Malaysia, are obviously deeply relevant to your own background. So I'm wondering, keeping in mind what I had heard you say to your own academic community in Malaysia, what is it that you are trying to get or achieve out of Southern theory or decolonial theory? Is it not, as I'm guessing or fishing for, more of a reconstitution or reformation of the way that theory is done in the so-called South than a process of decolonizing the center?
Can you repeat that last part? Is it
Yes.
more a way of?
Well, one thing I'll probably talk about more tomorrow and the day after is the way in which so-called post-colonial theory has an obsession with reformation of the center. As I like to joke, in India, that India is only post-colonial in winter, when all the Indians who are in universities in the West come to India to discuss decolonization. This obsession doesn't seem to be shared by you, either in the paper or in what I've seen you lecture. Rather, your concern seems to be how to deploy the strategies and insights of Southern theory within the South itself.
Yeah.
And I think this is significant.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I didn't think of it that way, but I think you might be right. I see Southern theory or alternative discourses counter-Eurocentric theories as something that's intellectually and academically needed, and one can argue for it on theoretical grounds and on political grounds. But there's also an aesthetic dimension to it, that there's a whole world of ideas out there which is interesting to tap on, right? For example, so I don't insist that the only way to understand the world is by having Khaldunian theory. I don't insist on that. But nevertheless, the ingredients are out there. Why not make use of those ingredients to cook an interesting and tasty dish? Not that that is the only dish that's going to save your health, right? So I think that's one way to look at it. But there's also a practical dimension. There are issues that we need to deal with. And when students come to me and say, students who are doing an academic thesis, an honors thesis, or even an undergraduate level thesis, or they might be doing a master's thesis, they come to us and they say, can you suggest a topic? Which I think is the wrong way to go about it, because they should be dealing with topics for which they have a passion, right? They should be selecting topics based on what they think are real problems going on in their community, in their society, in their family. I had one student who wrote a thesis on divorce because she went through divorce. So there was a very strong personal connection, and she learned a lot about objectivity because she had to learn how to detach herself, right? But students think that detachment should be that you work on something that you have no personal interest in, which is not the case, right? So I feel that there's so many issues going on in our society, and I've written about what's going on in Malaysia, that we can act as a stimulus for our work, and bring the whole idea of alternative counter-Eurocentric knowledge and relate it to those specific issues. Yeah. So it's aesthetic, it's political, it's intellectual, but it's also personal.
Yeah. I think you achieved that very well in the paper. Moving to the first section, it's called A Budget of Alternatives. And here you begin with Walter Mignolo and speak in terms of options of modernity, or I should put my coffee down and say modernity in the quotation marks, by which you mean something like westernization, capitalism, development, as only one option, the hegemonic option, but still just one among others. And then you immediately make the claim that much of the humanities and social sciences play the ideological role of strengthening our conviction in this modernity, this specific modernity, as the best or even as the only option. So given that TINA, or there is no alternative, dominates even the humanities and social sciences, given that there's an antagonism between the economic, political, and the cultural ideological modes of critique within the humanities and social sciences the world over, and given that some of us pursue a radical agenda and others of us pursue a reformative agenda, I want to ask you your own question. Where do you place Southern and decolonial theory within these distinctions? Now, I know you sketched this a little bit in the conclusions, but it's such a striking and important question that I think it would be good if you spoke about it.
Yeah, when I was thinking about these issues, I was also at the same time thinking of two people. I was thinking of Rewin and Mignolo, right? In Mignolo, it's quite clear to me that he's saying that there is an alternative, and that what Rewin would call Southern theory is theory that should not only be conceptually innovative and think not just, as you put it, Rewin, not just about but through the ideas of thinkers from the South. You mentioned Shariati and others. Should not simply just do that, but should also critique the very order and not just promote a more democratic polity, but think and call for an alternative order. But I think that is pushing the idea of Southern theory into a particular political direction. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but we can't confuse someone's political leanings with the idea of being intellectually autonomous or independent. In other words, the question is, can we say that to be intellectually autonomous or independent, to extricate oneself from the problem of intellectual imperialism means that one has to make a choice between capitalism, for example, and socialism? I think I don't think I would say that, but I think some people are saying that.
Then you move on to discuss Mignolo, and in doing so you speak of his two-pronged conception of de-Westernization and decoloniality. And I think you do that, why you just explained, because you perceive decolonial theory as working simultaneously on two levels of that classical antagonism between economy and ideology. And then this leads you to come up to 5 kind of characteristics that I think either you identify in Southern and decolonial theory or you demand from Southern and decolonial theory. 1, that they demystify dominant discourse and interrogate rival discourses. 2, that they are or offer their own alternatives. 3, that they are or offer or promote rival epistemologies. 4, that they are or offer alternatives in both domains, economy and ideology or culture. And 5, that they be preconditioned by promotion of democracy. And then in your paper, you give 2 case studies that illustrate number 1 and number 5. Mm-hmm. Save time, I'll just go to your 5th section, which is called Alternative Discourses and Democratic Ends, where he tries to present some alternative discourses. There are basically 2 sets of case studies. One is the persecution of Malaysia's Shiites. And this is a call to action on the part of Dr. Alatas. You appeal to scholars to study this matter in such a way that will influence policy to change. And the second is on Hindu-Muslim relations in Malaysia. And it's another call to action where you suggest that Al-Biruni's work could be disseminated to teach Malays of resources internal to their own tradition that can help to recalibrate the way these tensions are playing out.
That basically do not demonize Hinduism.
That don't demonize
and take it as a serious religious and intellectual tradition.
So this kind of academic activism is interesting. The problem that I face is that I find myself equally put in a discomfort from seeing, on the one hand, the risk of a lack of activism, where theory becomes merely the perpetuation of discourses that strengthen the base. And on the other side, when I see work like yours, which presents theory as a call to action, then I start to feel uncomfortable about whether how activist ought the scholar to be? Should the research agenda be taken up with a mission in mind? I'm not attacking you in this question. These are questions that your paper forced me to ask about my own work. Do you have any comments to make about
that? Last point, should the researcher
it's clear that what you've attempted to do in the paper is set an agenda, and in some respects you indicate work that should be, there's a moral imperative, an injunction that scholars need to bring this kind of work in. And I'm wondering if a research agenda can be set by a moral injunction. It makes me uncomfortable. I agree with you, but I have discomfort about it.
Well, I would wonder how a research agenda, be devoid of any moral injunction. I don't think they ever are. Perhaps the claim is made, this idea of a dispassionate, disinterested researcher. Well, I mean, maybe that's why some departments are very boring, because people are actually trying to be dispassionate and disinterested.
Yeah.
I think I do believe in objectivity, which comes from knowing exactly what your interests are and what your prejudices are, and of course they should not come into your research at certain phases of your of your research activities. But I think students and researchers should choose their topic based on their interest, based on what they think is wrong or what they think is right. And if they are, and they should be thinking about issues in their own communities, their own societies, so that there could be some impact. Because we don't really have a choice. You see, it's always useful to talk about these things in concrete terms, so we can actually see the importance of having a moral stake in things in our work. So, talk about the persecution of Shiites. This is not, an historical topic. We're not talking about the persecution of Shiites in the 7th century or the 15th century. We're talking about persecution of Shiites today. These are people whose lives are being affected. It happened recently in some states in Malaysia that Shiite couples were not allowed to get married because they're not considered as Muslims, for example. You have hate speech. You have people being, told to leave the mosque because when the congregation discovers that they are Shiite. These kinds of things are happening. There's some discrimination in the workplace. So you can't be objective or impartial about these things. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. My point is that a sociologist, an historical sociologist, an historian, can uncover or reacquaint Muslims, Sunni Muslims, with their own tradition, to show that in our tradition we have not taken such an attitude towards Shiites, and that the current anti-Shiism has to do with Salafi or Wahhabi influence. Right? Now all this can be done in a very objective manner. The goal, of course, is based on some moral injunction or moral imperative. But I think it's very, you can separate the morality of your goal from the need to be. You can distinguish that from the need to be objective in actually doing the research. Yeah. Yeah.
So Henrik has indicated that we've run out of time, so I'll just mention in the conclusion that there's an analogy that I think anyone should be able to perceive here between what he has just given in that case study, that there are resources within the tradition to deal with the current situation, and he expands that idea to decolonial theory as such, that there are resources within, or we need to cultivate and find the resources within alternative epistemologies and traditions and movements and literature to deal with problems that escape or are even caused by dominant theory. And it's an excellent work and very thought-provoking, and I really enjoyed reading it. Thank you.
Thank you.